I'm going to start with an icebreaker, just to warm everyone up, because I suspect most people are in their offices now with the standard NHS lunch of a packet of crisps, a fizzy drink, and that may or may not be branded, and also a sandwich. So when we're talking about long length of stay, we often see these two quotes, and I've included the reference, the evidence papers there for you to use, and it's often worthwhile if you've got doctors who want to look at this or trying to do something around long length of stay, using that evidence in grand rounds, those kind of settings, is quite useful. So I'll put those up there for you to look at. But we see, and we quote the first statistic, 48% of people over 85 die within 1 year of hospital admission. And then we see this other quote, which is 10 days in hospital leads to the equivalent of 10 years of aging in the muscles of people over 80. And that's a little bit of poetic license, because actually if you look at the evidence, what you see in essence is any bed rest in any older person leads to functional decline. But obviously the evidence is not quite as catchy as the phrase above. Now, in my experience, I found both of these statements pretty unhelpful, if I'm honest, when it comes to clinical engagement. I talked to the team and I explained about 48% of people over 85 die within 1 year of hospital admission, and I often get the feedback, well, you know, old people die, that's not exactly a shocker, is it? And then 10 days in hospital leads to the equivalent of 10 years of aging for people over 80. Well, we don't really know what that means because we're not 80. And so when we're looking at particularly the junior members of the team on the ward, they really don't get what that means. So one of our geriatricians who works with us did this a couple of years ago, and I've used it not quite daily, but most days ever since, as a way to engage our teams in what this means. So you'll need space to stand up, and this is an interactive bit. So I'm going to try and do it, so you'll see me move off of screen. If you sit back in your chair, and you need to have space for you to be able to stand up, ankles behind your knees, and just stand straight up. That should be pretty straightforward, and then you can sit back down. Now, if you're 80, that feels like having your ankles in line with your knees. So if you now line up your ankles with your knees, and again without support, try and stand up. And you should find that that is a lot more difficult than the first time. The last time, or last moment, is when if we move our ankles in front of our knees and try and stand up. This is going to mimic what it is like for an 80-year-old who's been in bed for a significant period of time. So ankles in front of your knees, now try and get up without support. That's not very easy. Now, I would really encourage the use of icebreakers like that with your teams, because I found it really helpful, because suddenly people go, oh, that's what being in hospital does to you. That's what being in bed does to you. So I just throw that in to warm us up quite literally. Now, today's webinar is about effective board rounds, and you can see on the slide ahead in front of you now that the board round process is part of a number of tools or processes that we can use to help reduce length of stay. And most importantly, it's part of a process to ensure that we can get the right patient into the right environment at the right time. And what does that mean? Well, I'm a gastroenterologist, and you know, I do things with cameras that other people don't do. But if there is an acute upper GI bleed that comes into my hospital today, then I think I can, and my team can look after that patient better than, say, a respiratory team or an endocrinology team. And so what we need to do is get that patient into our bed in a timely manner to provide them effective care. Now, another bit of pub trivia for you is show your age potentially. We talk about right patient, right environment, right time. We also talk about the old-fashioned martini principle based on the slogan, the martini adverts in the 1980s. I can't share that with my trainees because they're too young, but I suspect some of you on the webinar today will remember those adverts. And if you could enter in on the chat room what the slogan from the martini adverts were in the 1980s, it should bring a smile to your face. So when we talk about board rounds and reducing long length of stay, it's really important that we don't forget the reason why we emphasize that. And that's because actually the most significant impact we can have on reducing long length of stay is on the wards. It's not in ED and it's not out in the community. And we often forget that, and it all often feels that it's someone else's problem. But in reality, we have much more control over it than we think. This data is aggregated from national data. It's a couple of years old, but I don't think it's changed significantly. And this is the next few slides I use a lot in terms of engaging with teams because it highlights the importance of getting flow right. If you look at the median length of stay on the right, it's in days. For patients who are admitted in a timely way into the right bed, you can see the figures there. But if we don't have good flow, or we don't get the patient in the right bed, we can see the knock-on effect. So patients admitted after 4 hours have nearly twice the length of stay of those admitted before, and similarly if you're in an outlying non-medical bed. This is for medical patients. One of the things that I encourage people to do, both in my own organisation and elsewhere, is to actually measure that. Because at a team or a ward-based level, most of your teams that you're dealing with will have outliers, and they're quite difficult to manage from the team's perspective. And if you get them to measure that and look at the length of stay of those patients, but then encourage them to then get the patients into the right bed, to pull the patients onto the base wards rather than just waiting for them to be pushed to an outlier ward, it can be quite an effective tool. The next couple of slides we've been using, well, I've certainly used these slides for the last 20 years, and again, the data hasn't really changed. You know this, I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted, but what we need to do is just reiterate this, and again, encourage teams to measure it on the take, on their own wards, and what we are after is a left shift in the curve. Now, apologies, because the graphics seem to have changed. The blue and the yellow seems to have come across as a slight khaki, and we've got a split colour here. But if we left shift the curve, if we get the discharges earlier in the day, actually it's easier to get the right patient into the right bed at the right time. So when it comes to board rounds, we quite often talk about SAFER, and this is a tool that ECIST came up with several years ago based in a trust in the Midlands that was used to effectively engage clinical teams. Now, I have to say, somewhat controversially, I got into board rounds before SAFER came around, and we don't use SAFER on our board rounds on my base ward, but we do adhere to the SAFER principles. And the SAFER principles are, as you can see, senior review. All patients have an expected discharge date and clinical criteria for discharge. We try and pull the patients onto the wards, so encouraging flow, and we try to discharge the patients as early as possible, and we use the discharge lounge and other means to get the patients out of the ward as quickly as possible. We also have a review, as almost everywhere does nowadays, of those with a length of stay that's greater than 7 days. And we have senior review before midday where possible. And it's senior review, not necessarily consultant review. So we support our junior staff to undertake that kind of activity with our support. Oh, I forgot, I jumped ahead. We've actually got another interactive session now. So we've got a couple of polls to run. So this is a yes/no question you can answer online. So the first question is, have you used SAFER in your trust, yes or no? And just to make it really interactive, we've got some appropriate music, and our timing starts now. There we go. So 82% of you have, which is 27, and 6 of you, 18%, haven't, which is fine. Another question then, for those who said no, do you use a different or an alternative structured approach? So again, vote now. Very much. So half of you have, just over half have, and 45% haven't. So the last poll is, whatever your approach, whether it's structured or using SAFER, have you had to relaunch your board round processes in the last 2 years? Okay, so of those of you who voted, it was just over 60% of you voted, 93% of you have had to relaunch board round initiatives in the last 2 years. And I think that's really telling, and I should just also point out that that is our experience as well. It's not unusual. And so one of the things that I'm hoping to explore with you and share with you is our journey in East London on our ward, and also to encourage you to share ideas using the chat room. We can collate those at the end of the webinar. So one of the things that we also look at is red to green days. So one of the SAFER principles about setting an estimated discharge date is that you assume that there are no delays to the patient care. And one of the ways of looking at this is with red to green days. Again, another ECIST tool. And I've got another poll for you, because one of the questions is, do you measure red to green in your organisation? So more than half of you don't, which is not a surprise, I have to say. And I've got another question then. If, for those of you who do, so that was the minority of people who do you think measuring it is effective? Great, thank you very much. I have to say that would be my experience. One of the reasons for putting that poll in was actually for a bit of information and intelligence for us as a team, because we will need to look at that and reflect on that, I think. It would be really helpful if you could let us know your thoughts on that through the chat room. We have set up some webinars into beginning of March, I think, isn't it, Lucy?
5th of March.
Actually, the 5th of March. But then we have space up until the end of March and beginning of April to put on extra webinars that can be co-designed with yourselves. So if you would like a webinar on red to green days or any of the SAFER principles, please put that into the chat room and we'll collate that and feedback later on. I got into board rounds about 8-9 years ago, when I was finishing my training and becoming a consultant, and we were looking at flow on our ward and realizing that it was not as good as it could be, and we had a lot of other people's patients on our ward, and a lot of our patients were not on our ward. So we undertook a quality improvement project based on our ward and actually published that as a poster at one of the safety conferences. We, as a group, got together and agreed the why it was important for us. And it was really important we did that as a team, so it wasn't me as a doctor or anyone else, it was just the whole MDT. We took a variety of approaches and we used PDSA cycles, and we evaluated it using a combination of quantitative and qualitative evaluation techniques. And I think I would really encourage all of those things, and I'll come back on to why that's important. And I've put in a quote here that is in the poster. I'll leave you to read, but for me that really resonates to the wards then and actually to the wards now. And what we found is actually of relevance now, probably more so than it was then. And we found that a significant number, at least almost half our patients, were arriving on the wards out of hours. So that led to exposing patients to clinical risk, our teams not knowing the patients and less staff and less access. So that the night team felt very vulnerable with that. And actually we had, for a 28-bedded ward, we had on average almost 5 new patients every day. So this concept from a medical take team about whether you're on take or not on take was somewhat moot, because the base wards were taking 5 new patients every day that no one knew when they arrived at work. We also found familiar pictures with delays, but actually what we found was when it came to estimating discharge dates, all of these delays that you can see here, many of them were in our control as an MDT, and we were able to reduce these by more effective MDT working, but we measured them and fed them back, and that's really what the value of the long length of stay reviews are, but it needs to be owned by the MDT on the ward. And finally, I really like this slide. I won't do it as a poll, but you can see there was a difference in the mean length of stay between July 2012 and August 2012, and that just reflected a change of the junior doctors. So we had new junior doctors by the end of the summer. Before they became a year more senior, they became pretty slick at this, and then we had to start again a month later when the new juniors started. And the importance of this is that actually we can't just ignore SAFER or any of the board round processes. We constantly need to support, educate and train our staff to do this, because they're changing every day. Now, unfortunately, it's not all good news. You can see the picture on the left-hand side is actually the ward at the beginning of December. You can see the small Christmas tree, which is slightly ironic in East London, given the population we serve. And the board round is as challenged now as it was 8 years ago. And so we decided to relaunch but reinvestigate why that was. And there are a lot of issues. We have real challenges with staffing across the MDT, and it is not infrequent for us to have different clinical staff at every board round every day. So there's really a struggle with continuity of care. I think the patients are sicker. Things like the acuity measurements weren't done 8 years ago, they are now, and we can see that the patients on the ward are sicker than they were. It's more challenging to meet with relatives and explain the situation with relatives and patients for that matter. There seems to be more paperwork than ever, and actually there are pressures elsewhere in the system. So I normally quote my juniors at this stage who remind me that they can't be at the board round at 9 o'clock because they also need to be at handover, but they also need to be in the bereavement office if there have been any deaths overnight, and they also have teaching. And that's just the doctors, and it's the same for the therapists and the nursing team as well. So we're really struggling, as I'm sure you all are, and I don't have any solutions other than just to make sure that when you're leading change that you recognise and are compassionate to these challenges. So we reviewed things and we started using the board round checklist. This is an ECIST tool. We'll provide the links with that at the end of the webinar, but it was really helpful, particularly when we've got new staff coming onto the MDT. They can just hold it and have a look at it as we're going through the board round. I think it's a really valuable and very simple to use. And then we also agreed that rather than going into too much detail, we would ask and use these 4 questions, which will be familiar to most of you, about every patient on the ward. And if any of us couldn't answer the question, then that in itself begged the question. And it's a really powerful prompt for the clinical team. I'll leave you to read that, but we can go into that in more detail in another webinar if you like to. But I can't emphasize the power of this enough. And maybe on the chat room you could share your experience if you are using the 4 questions and share your ideas. And we ended up agreeing as a team, these 4 principles. So again, it wasn't around SAFER. It wasn't using SAFER, but it was using SAFER principles. So we agreed that every patient would have an EDD set within 14 hours of admission. We would make sure that we add value to the patient every day they are in hospital, and we do use red to green, but we don't measure it, and we use red to green as a concept, and people really buy into that. We understand and try our best to discharge patients early in the day, and that allows us to reduce our outliers. Importantly, we found that actually the wrap-up in the afternoon was being really poorly attended, and so the MDT committed to the value of that wrap-up, and it has made a real difference. It's not led by the consultant, it's led by the ward manager, or in fact it's led by the nurse in charge of the ward, and they find it incredibly useful, and actually so do the MDT. And we can look at who's been allocated work, whether it's been done, if there's any delays, and things can get escalated, and it's really effective. So one of the key things is that one size doesn't fit all. And when we originally did this work 8-9 years ago, actually it was praised and celebrated, and everyone thought it was a panacea for the whole of flow across the trust. And of course it isn't, and that's because what happens on an acute general medical ward is different to what happens on a rehab ward. It's different to what happens on a stroke ward. I've given an example of what happens on our base ward. I can't tell you the same for patients who are outlying under our care on other wards. And I'm a general physician, so I do general medical on call, and I'm able as such to make decisions on any medical patient, young or old, who happens to be on our ward. That's not the same for surgery. So if you have mixed surgical wards that may have trauma and orthopedics, urology, general surgery, breast surgery, it's very difficult for example, a consultant surgeon to make a decision across the board. And you may want to think about different models for that kind of environment. We do know, for example, on surgery, that there's very good evidence that criteria-led discharge, which is often nurse-initiated or therapy-initiated, is highly effective. And that's not often the case on a medical ward. And obviously, if you've got an acute medical unit, you may not want to be delaying patient care. And so rather than doing a board round first thing in the morning and last thing in the afternoon, you might want to be seeing the patients, discharging proactively, and then focus more on a wrap-up. One of the models that I really like and we've used elsewhere has come from Gloucester, and I put it on there about the SORT, and there are other acronyms, SHOP is another one, but this concept that you focus on the sick patients, the patients who are going home today or tomorrow, the out today or tomorrow, then you look at the rest of the patients, and then you look at what your TCI list is, the patients who you need to pull onto the ward. I found that really helpful, particularly on wards that have a consultant-led afternoon ward round. It just gives a really quick structure for the clinical teams to focus their work in the morning, their efforts in the morning, and increase flow. I think at this stage, I'd also highlight that if you have any examples, could share those on the chat room, it would be really valuable. We'd love to hear from you about them, and we'd like to share those amongst yourselves. So as I come to the end of my talking, just wanted to highlight a couple of the available resources. We've put them on here. If you basically Google SAFER, you'll be taken to the NHS Improvement website where most of these resources are. We've also got a YouTube channel which has got some short clips, which is good to use in presentations. And then we've got a couple of allied campaigns. One is Red to Green, and the other one is the NPJ Paralysis, which is about reducing patients being in bed in hospital. And what we find with NPJ Paralysis is it a bit like SAFER. It goes through a phase of being highly effective, and then it dips off and is relaunched and is highly effective again. But what we're trying to do is get that culture of getting people dressed, moving out of bed on every ward every day. So for me, the key components of effective board rounds are listed here. I can't emphasize enough the MDT engagement. It's not about me, the consultant, it's about the junior doctors. They spend much more time with the patients than I do. The ward nurses, and it's not the nurse in charge, it's the band 5 in the bay, the therapy staff, the pharmacy team, all of the MDT down to the ward clerk. And the way it worked well for us was that we all owned and co-designed the solution. So it wasn't imposed on us, no one came and told us what to do. It was our process. The second thing is we don't have an electronic solution at the moment, which actually is not a bad thing for us. We have an old-fashioned whiteboard with a board marker, and actually we put people's names against actions, both for today and tomorrow. And then at the wrap-up huddle in the afternoon, we have a degree of accountability and responsibility that our teams find really helpful. It's important that it's not then used as blame, but it's about support, and we found it very effective. I've already alluded to the afternoon huddles, but I can't emphasize the value of those enough. And also, if you are doing a relaunch or looking at this, do use a PDSA approach. Measure, measure, and then measure again. And that's one of the things that we struggle with when people relaunch programs. They don't ask the questions about why it hasn't worked in the first place, and then they don't measure necessarily the things that are important to the staff who are doing the board rounds. And one of the key things is the qualitative information from the staff. And I put in supporting failure. In true QI approaches, we should encourage our teams to try something different. But if they measure it and it doesn't work, then they can stop it. But if you don't measure, you won't know. So I'm a big fan of supporting failure, which sounds a bit odd. And then finally, share the learning in a compassionate kind of way. We did a series of peer reviews where we would go and observe other people's board rounds, not to say that they should do it one way or another way, but actually to share ideas about what's worked for us, what hasn't worked for us. And we found that really valuable, and we learned an awful lot on our own ward with that approach. From an organisational perspective, there are key ingredients to success, and these are in the SAFER guide, and they won't come as a surprise because they're actually the key ingredients to success for most change in most NHS organisations. That you need strong clinical leadership, you need a clear communication strategy which is meaningful for your staff, and you need to try and generate a social movement. So I'm terrible at social media, Facebook and Twitter, but actually our staff use it a lot. And we have a bleep system in place, for example, that none of the junior doctors use because they all use WhatsApp to communicate. So actually thinking outside the box as leaders and thinking differently is really important, and supporting the staff to communicate how they see fit. I've talked about measurement, but it's really important. And finally, all of this does need executive support, and you need to have the medical director, the director of nursing, the COO, chief executive, a non-exec, someone who's really passionate about this, fighting the corner and supporting the clinical engagement. So I think I'll wrap up there because I'm hoping, I can't see the chat room, but I'm hoping that there's lots of questions that we can then share and ask at this stage. So I'll hand it over to the chat room team to see where we go next. Thank you all for your attention.
Hi, Andrew. Yeah, it's Angela. The chat room, we've had some really interesting discussions, mainly about the afternoon huddles. We've had discussions about who's been present on the afternoon huddles, the effectiveness of them, what the output is, how we get engagement. I think there's been a lot of talk about engagement of staff, various different staff groups. Some people have asked how at a lower band they can engage people of a higher band. One of the suggestions would maybe be to always start, like you said, start with the why. Why are we doing this? Help people to understand that Safer Patient Flow Bundle, Red to Green Days, they're not performance management tools. They're there to help improve, to move patients along in their journey. And try and use a patient story as well. I often, we find that when we go onto sites, just looking for missed opportunities and parts of the pathway that we could do differently, we can challenge ourselves to really think outside the box, and are we doing the right thing for our patients in the right time? There's been a lot of talk around timely discharges, what times, and having executive, you were right at the end, executive oversight and support. So for the Safer Patient Flow Bundle, often for the S and the A, we would say that would be the medical director to have oversight. The F and the E would be the chief nurse to have oversight, and the R would be the COO. So having that really senior level, top level support will really help to get that message out and for it to become business as usual.
Thanks, Angela. Can I pick up on a couple of the, there was an awful lot there.
Sorry.
Can I pick up on, that's all right. I'll pick up on a couple of the earlier points, if that's okay. One about the engaging the more junior members of the team, engaging the more senior members of the team, and vice versa. So this is about clinical engagement, I guess. Well, I just wanted to signpost people to webinar last week about creating a narrative and the patient story. So one of the things that was really powerful for us, and it's very specific to our ward because it's a gastroenterology ward, we have a lot of patients with, or in fact we are the default position for patients who are withdrawing from alcohol. And actually we had a number of patient safety incidents that affected our staff, and it was really highlighted that it was because the staff were arriving on, the patients were arriving on the ward out of hours because our discharge profile was wrong. So one of the things that is really important, and this is why it's ward specific, is to look at some of the data that you've got, listen to the feedback from your staff, and use that and link that in with some of the evidence we've shown today about length of stay, discharge process, and patient outcome. That was the first thing. The second thing was about the afternoon huddles. Actually, we used a couple of case studies on our ward about patients who seemed to have, well, they were classified as delayed transfers of care, but actually they weren't delayed transfers of care at all. It's that the MDT weren't communicating with each other. So what we found in terms of who should be there, one of the challenges is if you have the board round and it's just full of senior leaders like the ward manager, the consultant, the therapy lead, and the discharge coordinator, they'll actually see the patient first thing in the morning, or may not actually, and then at 2, 3, 3:30 in the afternoon, they're nowhere to be found. So the people who spend most time with the patients are the junior doctors, the therapists and therapy assistants, and the band 5 nurses or band 6 nurses on the ward. And so the afternoon huddle was a really good opportunity for that group of staff to meet together and share what they had been doing for the patients that day. What we did was use a couple of cases that we all agreed the patient's care could have been improved, to then work with them. I literally facilitated a meeting where they all said, oh, I think we should come up, and they all agreed what time it was, and then they all did it. So it wasn't about me telling people, it was just me supporting them to agree the why, and it actually made a big difference. Now, in terms of measuring it, well, again, we've done that qualitatively. Sometimes it's difficult to prove a reduction in stay, but actually you can demonstrate that on an individual patient level. If that makes sense, you can see the more complicated patients say half a day, day and a half less than they would before, and it's important to reflect that back to the team. The final thing I think was about executive support, and I would thoroughly agree. If you can get your COO, your medical director and your director of nursing on board for all of the safer principles, that's wonderful. If you can get some of them engaged, that's good. But if you can't get any of them engaged, you're going to really struggle. And hopefully our webinar series, which are recorded and available for the participants, you can use those and invite your executive team to join them.
10 more minutes or so of questions if there are more questions from the chat room. No other questions, Lucy, but I think just a really important point to make, Andrew picked up on, and I know we're doing a session in a couple of weeks on the data, but really use the data. We find when we go around, a lot of trusts have access to the data, but they just don't know how to use it or what they're doing with it. And we can go through this again in a bit more detail in a couple of weeks, but really look for those opportunities of grouping patients together in themes for why they've got an increased length of stay or why we can't get them out, and then look at bed days, how many bed days we can reduce, and really target what we might think is the quickest win might not be. And by targeting one group of patients, you will then have a direct impact on another. So it's not always the easiest option, but it might be the quickest.
So Angela, that's a really good point, and just there's a really easy way of starting the ball rolling on this. So if you have got a general medical team, for example, you can just get them to look at a case that is relevant to them. So for example, respiratory, they just take a age match patient on their ward, the respiratory based ward, versus an age match outlying patient, and look at their median length of stay. They will find a difference. And therefore that will engage the team and also engage the organisation to support them to get the right patient in the right bed at the right time.
And doctors love data, don't they, Andrew?
Yes, because the data's always wrong. I have to say, I'm quite unusual because I'm quite accepting of data. I quite like it. Right or wrong.
So just one more thing on the chat room. If you haven't provided your email address already, please can you, and then we can make sure that you get feedback form and slides from today. But thank you to everyone for all your feedback and your participation.
Angela, I was, I think, prompted to, someone may have mentioned about consultant engagement, is that right?
Yes, how do you get consultant engagement?
And obviously I can't say physical violence.
Bribery.
So bribery, well, yeah, joking aside, I think it's a real challenge. So the reality, and I use myself as an example, and I've had this conversation with the team, which is I'm pretty useful for an organisation. I do cancer work, I do endoscopy work, I do outpatients, I do general medicine, I do specialist medicine, and I can do all of those 5 things equally well, but I can't do all 5 of them at the same time. So there is a real organisational challenge around that. One thing that I would encourage people to support their consultant body to reflect on is how they support their junior team to develop and accept responsibility. And that does, so we have a very strong ethos of doing that within our team. So the registrars and indeed the core medical trainees all lead their own ward rounds, and then we do educational training around that and support them. And it's not necessary, any one of our MDT can lead the board round every day of the week. And they know that they can come and find us if we're not able to attend, or we can help unlock or see sick patients, whatever it is, we can unlock problems, facilitate early reviews, those kind of things. But it's not necessarily all about the consultants. I agree though, if you've got a consultant who's digging their heels in, that can be a real issue. But hopefully we've got some tools and some evidence that you can use to engage them with now.
Thank you very much. Angela, just one more time, is there anything else coming out from the chat room before we close?
No, nothing at the moment, Lucy. Everyone's going on putting their email addresses, so that's great. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, and we would really appreciate your feedback.
So I'm going to close my bit because I promised 2 pub trivia questions, didn't I? So what is the only uniform documentation in use in the NHS at present? Angela, were there any answers?
No, there were no answers, and I couldn't think of an answer. So.
Oh, there you go. It's a consent form. So, and it constantly makes me chuckle because we talk about everyone should do SAFER, or everyone should do board rounds, everyone should do this. We all do the same thing differently in every single hospital, apart from the legal stuff, which is a consent form. The second thing was, did anyone come up with the Martini slogan?
Yes, they did. I mean, it clearly wasn't the one I thought, which was "Every little helps." Shaken
and Tesco's, Angela.
Tesco's, yeah. Shaken and not stirred. And there was another one that I can't remember that seems to be more popular. Have you got the
the right answer is any time, any place,
That's it. That's
anywhere.
what most people said. There we go. I didn't write it down quick enough.
Good.
That's the answer.
Well, so that's a little telltale for the age demographic of the people dialing into the webinar, I think.
I don't think I was born when it was on the TV.
Yeah, most people don't even know what Martini is, Angela, so you're not alone, don't worry. I'll hand back to Lucy. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. So thanks everyone for joining. I hope you found that helpful session. Please do share your email addresses and we can keep you up to date, and we'd really, really love to hear your feedback so we can develop on these sessions and also start to make them bespoke based on topics that you would like to hear about. Just a little intro to the next session. So on Thursday next week, same time, we'll be having a session on criteria-led discharge. And we also have a schedule leading up to the 5th of March. So we've got another board round session today if any of your colleagues couldn't make this one. Criteria-led discharge next week, job planning the week after, DPTL, and then focus and site operations. And also a little tiny plug for an ECIST conference in March on emergency department leadership. If you're interested, please do put your email addresses down and we can send you the registration details for this event. Thank you very much for joining.